Anton Chigurh enters No Country for Old Men without an introduction, without a history, and without any explanation for how he became what he is. The film never tells us where he trained, who taught him, or what he did before the story begins. This absence is not a gap the Coen brothers forgot to fill. It is a deliberate choice, and it shapes how we're meant to understand him. Chigurh is not presented as a product of circumstances. He has no childhood trauma offered as an excuse, no ideology explained in dialogue, and while he is technically working a job, retrieving a satchel of drug money and eliminating anyone connected to it, that job never fully accounts for how he behaves. He kills people who have nothing to do with the money, follows his own private logic even when it works against his employer's interests, and treats the assignment less as a task to complete efficiently than as an occasion to act out something more personal. He simply exists, fully formed, moving through the world with a set of principles that he treats as self-evident. That's part of what makes him so unusual as a screen villain. Most antagonists are given a psychology we can trace, even if we don't sympathize with it. Chigurh resists this. He behaves less like a man with a backstory and more like a fixed point against which everything else in the film is measured. The other characters change, panic, adapt, or fail to adapt. Chigurh appears far more consistent, and it's that consistency, more than the violence itself, that unsettles the people he encounters. This is the first thing worth examining. What exactly is that internal logic, and does it hold up the way Chigurh seems to believe it does? Chigurh presents himself as someone who follows principles rather than impulses. He talks about how he arrived somewhere, about the nature of decisions, about the idea that certain outcomes were set in motion long before anyone in the room realized it. He speaks slowly and deliberately, as if he's not improvising his worldview in the moment, but reciting something he has already worked out in full. One expression of this, though not the only one, is his use of the coin toss. He doesn't perform this ritual with every person he kills. Most of his violence in the film happens without any coin at all, quickly and without ceremony. The toss appears at specific moments, with the gas station attendant and with Carla Jean, and its rarity is part of why it carries so much weight. When he does offer someone the choice to call heads or tails, he's not simply toying with them, at least not from his own perspective. He appears to believe that the coin removes his personal responsibility from the outcome. If the person calls correctly, they live. If they don't, he treats the result as something determined by the flip rather than by him. He tells the attendant that he got there the same way the coin did, suggesting that his own arrival in someone's life is just as impersonal, just as governed by forces outside anyone's control as a coin landing on one side or the other. This is where the film starts to raise a genuinely interesting philosophical question. Chigurh's comments around the coin point toward a kind of fatalism, the idea that events unfold according to a fixed sequence, and that human agency is an illusion layered on top of outcomes that were, in some sense, already decided. It's an old idea, one that shows up in various forms throughout the history of philosophy, from ancient discussions of fate to later debates about determinism and free will. What makes Chigurh's version distinct is how selectively he seems to apply it, and how much of his broader worldview extends well beyond this single object. If Chigurh truly believed that everything was determined in advance, the coin toss wouldn't need to exist at all. Determinism, in its stricter philosophical sense, doesn't require a coin. If everything is fixed by prior causes, then the outcome is already set before the coin ever leaves his thumb. Introducing an object of chance into a supposedly deterministic worldview creates a tension, and it's one the film seems aware of even if Chigurh isn't, or pretends not to be. What the coin toss actually does, in the moments he chooses to use it, is give Chigurh a mechanism for outsourcing responsibility. He can commit violence and simultaneously present himself as merely the executor of a decision made by something else. The coin can be read as a kind of moral alibi, one that allows him to feel, or at least to claim, that he isn't choosing to kill someone, but simply enforcing what the coin has already decided. This is a subtle but important distinction because it suggests that Chigurh's stated philosophy isn't only meant to explain the world, it may also be built, at least in part, to protect him from sitting with his own agency. There's a moment with Carla Jean late in the film that brings this tension into sharp focus. She refuses to participate in the ritual the way his previous targets did. She won't call heads or tails. She tells him, in effect, that the coin doesn't decide anything, that he's the one making the choice, and that pretending otherwise doesn't change what he's about to do. Chigurh doesn't have a fully convincing answer for this. He falls back on the same reasoning he always uses, but her refusal exposes how thin that reasoning can appear under direct challenge. The coin was never demonstrably the decision-maker. It can be understood, at least in this reading, as Chigurh using an object of chance as a kind of philosophical shield. This raises a deeper question the film seems interested in. Is Chigurh someone who has arrived at a genuine philosophical position, or is he someone who has constructed a belief system that helps him avoid the weight of what he does? There's a meaningful difference between fatalism as a philosophical stance and fatalism as a convenient narrative someone tells themselves. A person who fully believed in a deterministic universe would arguably have no need to ritualize anything through a coin flip. They would act, and whatever happened would happen, without performance attached to it. Chigurh doesn't perform the toss constantly, but when he does, the ritual itself suggests he needs it in that moment, perhaps to make sense of what he's doing, or to make it feel justified to himself and to the person in front of him. This is where the film quietly engages with a long-standing philosophical tension between determinism and moral responsibility. If events are predetermined, can anyone be meaningfully held responsible for anything? Philosophers have debated this for centuries without a settled answer. Chigurh doesn't appear interested in resolving the philosophical question itself. He seems more interested in using the unresolved nature of the question to excuse himself from consequences, borrowing the language of fate without actually surrendering control, since he still chooses who to pursue, when to act, and how to interpret whatever chance element he introduces. The belief system in this reading exists downstream of his actions rather than upstream of them. Chigurh's fatalism is only one part of a larger personal code, and that code may say more about him than the coin does. He treats his own word as something close to sacred. When he tells Carson Wells, and later Carla Jean, that he made a promise to Llewellyn Moss about what would happen to her if Moss didn't hand over the money, he keeps returning to that promise as though it has a binding force, independent of whether anyone else thinks it's reasonable. Wells tells him plainly that there's no need to go through with it, that Moss is already dead and nothing is served by killing Carla Jean. Chigurh's response isn't built around necessity or benefit, it's built around consistency. He said something, and so it happens, regardless of whether circumstances have changed in ways that would lead most people to reconsider. This insistence on keeping his word can look, on the surface, like a kind of honor. But it's worth noticing what that honor actually protects. It isn't protecting Carla Jean or serving any practical purpose related to the money or the job. It's protecting the coherence of Chigurh's own self-image. If he broke his word once, circumstances became inconvenient, he would have to admit that his principles bend to context the way anyone else's do. By following through regardless of outcome, he preserves the idea that he is governed by something more stable than ordinary human decision-making. The same logic extends to how he treats witnesses and loose ends. He frequently kills people who have no direct stake in the money or the conflict between him and Moss, simply because they've seen him or because they represent a variable he hasn't accounted for. This isn't cruelty for its own sake, at least not from his perspective. It's an extension of the same commitment to consistency. A witness is a piece of disorder left in the world, a fact that doesn't fit neatly into the outcome he intends, and removing that person is less an act of malice than an act of tidying. Compassion doesn't factor into this calculation because compassion, by its nature, responds to individual circumstances, and Chigurh has structured his behavior specifically to avoid responding to individual circumstances. He values rules over people because rules, unlike people, don't ask him to make exceptions. One of the more striking aspects of Chigurh's character is how little emotion he displays, even in situations that would provoke a strong reaction in almost anyone else. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't seem to feel triumph, anger, or hesitation. This flatness isn't simply a stylistic choice by the Coen brothers to make him seem cold. It's consistent with the persona he's built for himself and with the code discussed above. If he sees himself as carrying out something closer to inevitability, or at least something governed by principle rather than preference, then there's little room for emotional investment in the outcome. Emotion would imply that the result matters to him personally, and personal investment would undermine the image of detachment he maintains. This is also part of why his conversations are often more disturbing than his violence. When Chigurh talks to the gas station attendant about a coin that's been in his pocket for 22 years, the scene contains no physical threat in the traditional sense. Nobody draws a weapon, and yet the tension in that scene is considerable because Chigurh is slowly walking the attendant toward a decision the man doesn't fully understand he's being asked to make. Chigurh never explains what's at stake. He lets the atmosphere and the escalating strangeness of the conversation do the work. The unease isn't primarily in what he says, it's in what he implies, and in how calmly he implies it. This method, using conversation and implication rather than direct threats, separates Chigurh from a more conventional movie killer. He doesn't appear driven mainly by intimidation for its own sake. He seems interested in whether the other person will engage with his logic, whether they'll accept the terms he's offering. The violence, when it comes, often functions as confirmation of a process that has already played out in conversation. Underneath the fatalism and the code of promises sits a broader belief that seems to organize all of it. The sense that the world operates according to an objective order, one that exists whether or not people acknowledge it. Chigurh doesn't talk about this in abstract philosophical terms, but it's implicit in how he treats every situation. He approaches each encounter as though there is a correct outcome already latent in the circumstances, and his role is simply to bring that outcome into being without letting sentiment, negotiation, or persuasion divert it. This is part of why he seems so unmoved by pleading. When people try to bargain with him, offer him money, or appeal to mercy, he treats these attempts not as morally relevant arguments, but as noise, irrelevant static, layered on top of a result that isn't actually up for negotiation. From his perspective, the outcome exists independently of anyone's feelings about it, including, in theory, his own. Killing someone isn't something he wants in an emotional sense. It's something the situation requires in his own account of things, and his job is to execute that requirement cleanly. Seen this way, Chigurh's violence can be interpreted less as chaos and more as an attempt to impose order onto a world he perceives as sliding toward disorder. He behaves as though loose ends, broken promises, and unresolved situations are a kind of entropy that needs correcting. Every witness eliminated, every promise kept regardless of new information, every coin toss offered instead of an arbitrary decision, functions as a small act of imposing structure onto events that might otherwise remain messy or uncertain. Whether this order is genuinely present in the world, or whether Chigurh is simply projecting his own need for structure onto random and often senseless violence, is left deliberately unresolved by the film. Sheriff Ed Tom Bell exists in the film as a kind of counterweight to Chigurh, though their relationship is more layered than a simple standoff between good and evil. Bell comes from a tradition of law enforcement built on the assumption that crime, however bad it gets, follows a recognizable moral logic. Criminals want money, they want power, they act out of greed or desperation, and there's usually a reason, however flawed, behind what they do. Bell has spent his career operating within that framework, and it has served him reasonably well. Chigurh doesn't fit comfortably into that framework, and Bell senses this well before he fully understands why. Throughout the film, Bell talks about a sense that something has shifted, that the nature of violence in the world has changed into something he no longer recognizes. This isn't simply fear of a dangerous criminal, it's a deeper disorientation, the sense that the tools he's relied on to understand people no longer apply cleanly. Chigurh isn't driven primarily by greed or rage, and he doesn't behave like someone who can be reliably reasoned with or predicted using ordinary human motives, even if he isn't entirely detached from human motives either. Bell and Chigurh never actually meet on screen, and the film is careful about this. Bell isn't shown simply refusing a confrontation out of straightforward fear. His arc is built more around a growing awareness that his understanding of crime and justice, formed over decades, may no longer be adequate for what he's encountering. His eventual retirement isn't framed as a defeat inflicted by a stronger opponent. It plays more as an acknowledgement that the world has produced something he no longer has the conceptual tools to fully process, and that continuing to police it as though it still worked the old way would be its own kind of self-deception. Near the end of the film, after Chigurh has finished what he came to do, he's involved in a serious car accident, one that has nothing to do with Moss, the money, or any of the people he's been pursuing. It arrives suddenly, without warning, and without any of the deliberate control that has defined his behavior up to that point. He's injured, disoriented, and has to rely on strangers, two boys who happen to be nearby, to help him. He pays one of them for a shirt to use as a makeshift sling, and to keep quiet about having seen him. This scene invites more than one reading, and the film doesn't insist on a single interpretation. It can be read as a direct challenge to everything Chigurh claims to represent. If he sees himself as an agent of an impersonal order, moving through the world in step with forces beyond ordinary human control, then an accident that has nothing to do with fate or judgment and everything to do with ordinary bad luck undercuts that self-image. There's no coin involved, no one to blame, no logic to extract. It simply happens, the way accidents happen to anyone, and Chigurh's response, quietly managing an injury with the help of strangers, looks very little like the calm inevitability he's projected throughout the film. At the same time, the scene can be read in a way that reinforces rather than undermines his worldview. If Chigurh genuinely believes that outcomes are governed by forces indifferent to human intention, then the accident is simply another instance of that principle, applied to him instead of to someone else. He doesn't seem angry or existentially shaken by it in any dramatic way. He deals with the injury the same way he deals with everything else, without much visible emotion, adapting to new information and continuing on. In this reading, the accident doesn't refute his philosophy so much as confirm that he, too, is subject to the same impersonal order he claims governs everyone. The film seems to leave both readings available, and that ambiguity is likely intentional. Chigurh survives, limping but alive, and walks away from the scene much as he's walked away from everything else, which suggests the story isn't interested in delivering a clean moral punishment or a tidy philosophical resolution. This brings up a question that has kept audiences arguing for years. Is Chigurh meant to be understood as a realistic human being or as something closer to a symbol, an embodiment of an idea rather than a fully naturalistic character? The film gives evidence for both readings without settling on either. On one hand, Chigurh is physically vulnerable. He gets injured, he bleeds, he has to treat his own wounds, and the car accident discussed above leaves him shaken and limping, clearly affected by ordinary physical cause and effect. these aren't the traits of a purely symbolic or supernatural figure. On the other hand, his behavior, his manner of speaking, and the way other characters react to him all carry a weight that goes beyond straightforward realism. People who encounter him often describe him in terms that suggest he feels less like an individual and more like a force that has entered their lives from somewhere else. The Coen brothers seem to have built this ambiguity into the character on purpose, and Cormac McCarthy's original novel already carries the same tension, presenting Chigurh as unsettling partly because he resists being filed neatly into either category. Reading him purely as a realistic hitman flattens some of what makes him effective, but reading him purely as an allegorical figure risks ignoring the very human details that ground him in the story. The most interesting interpretation may be that he exists deliberately in the space between the two, a man who behaves as though he operates on the level of a symbol or a force, while remaining underneath that performance an ordinary and mortal human being. It's worth asking directly whether Chigurh consistently follows the philosophy he presents, or whether he applies it selectively, in whatever way happens to suit the moment. The evidence points towards selective application more than perfect consistency. He offers the coin toss to some people and not to others, without ever explaining what determines who receives that offer and who doesn't. He claims to be indifferent to outcomes, yet pursues Moss with clear determination and reacts, in his own restrained way, when things don't go according to plan. He frames himself as someone who doesn't make exceptions, yet the entire concept of an exception depends on a rule existing in the first place, and it isn't obvious that Chigurh's rules are anything more than preferences he's decided to treat as absolute. This doesn't necessarily mean his philosophy is empty or purely performative. It's possible to hold a genuine belief and still apply it inconsistently, the way people do with almost any principle they claim to live by. But it does suggest that Chigurh's stated worldview functions, at least in part, as a framework he reaches for when it's useful, whether to justify a killing, to explain away a moment of apparent mercy, or to present himself, to others and possibly to himself, as something more coherent and controlled than his actual behavior demonstrates. Chigurh's philosophy, taken as a whole, is less a single fixed idea than a loose collection of instincts dressed up as principle, a belief in impersonal order, a code built around promises and consistency, a discomfort with loose ends, and an occasional invocation of chance to explain away outcomes he's actually chosen. None of these pieces fit together with perfect logical consistency, and the film doesn't appear interested in forcing them to. What holds them together instead is Chigurh's own conviction that they do fit, that his behavior reflects something larger and more stable than personal preference. That conviction is what makes him disturbing in a way that goes beyond simple violence. He isn't unique in constructing a belief system that conveniently absolves him of responsibility, or in treating his own rules as more binding than other people's. People do versions of this constantly, on much smaller scales, when they attribute their choices to circumstances, to fate, to the idea that they had no real alternative. Chigurh does it with unusual calm, unusual consistency, and far higher stakes than most people ever will, and the car accident near the end suggests that even he isn't fully exempt from the disorder he claims to be correcting. So the question the film leaves us with isn't only whether Chigurh believes in fate, it's whether anyone can build a philosophy elaborate enough to fully outrun the fact that they are still the one making the choice. Chigurh acts, most of the time, as though he's found a way around that problem, treating the coin, his promises, and his sense of order as evidence that something other than his own will is directing events. The film doesn't confirm this, and it doesn't fully deny it either. It simply keeps returning to the same observation, quietly, without insisting on it. The coin has never demonstrably decided anything on its own, and the order Chigurh claims to be following may have far more to do with what he needs to believe about himself than with anything genuinely governing the world around him.